Toronto Star. I'm Raju Mudler, and this matters. Life is like riding a bicycle. To keep your balance, you must keep moving. That's a quote attributed to Albert Einstein. And if you are a cycling fan in this city, this pandemic has brought a boon of new bike lanes and road closures on the weekend as part of the Active TO program to encourage people to get out, ride, and spaciously enjoy the great outdoors. Now, if you've been cycling in the city for a while, what's a bit weird about this is that previously getting a bike lane always seemed to take a tooth and nail fight. Do you remember the war on the car? Well, if we were still in that skirmish, bike lanes have annexed over 40 kilometers of territory in the city this spring. Today, we are going to present two columnist counterpoints on this. We will be joined by Matt Elliott, who is a city affairs columnist for the Star, who is pretty happy about the city rolling along with this. But first, let's talk to someone who thinks maybe we should have our foot on the brake with some of these plans. Norris McDonald is a columnist for the Toronto Star in the Wheel section, of which he is a longtime former editor. He is a member of the Canadian Motorsport Hall of Fame and pretty much an all-around newspapering legend who I love to have as a former colleague. It is so nice to welcome you to the podcast, Norris. Thank you so much for being here.
Listen, it's my pleasure, and I will return the compliment by saying it's been a pleasure to work and to have known you over the years. I'm sorry, like many people, we're not in the office these days. It would be nice to see your smiling face on occasion.
The same, Norris. And now, I also know that you are the greatest sport in the world, because you know that I'm having you on here to be the curmudgeonly car guy. But I actually do think you made some great points. Now, you wrote a column a few weeks ago that basically said that under the cover of this virus, City Council has added 40 kilometers of bike lanes. What do you think about that?
Well, I was appalled at the time. I've calmed down a little bit since. We're in the middle of a pandemic. People don't know what day it is half the time. Now, I know that we're coming out of it now and we can go to the malls again and get our hair cut. But when this happened, it was relatively early in the crisis, and people had their minds on other things. And City Council took it upon themselves to extend 40 kilometers of bike lanes throughout Toronto, which is the biggest one-year expansion in the history of bike lanes in the city of Toronto. And I think if they had tried to do this when everybody was paying attention, there would have been more pushback. Now, you know something, Raju? I happen to be a fan of bike lanes. That column, and of course, you know, when you write a column and you want to be controversial, you want a reaction. And boy, oh boy, did I ever get a reaction. I got killed on Twitter. The person who handles the letters to the editor of the Toronto Star said she could have filled 2 complete pages of the paper. So naturally, I took a few liberties and a couple of shots about exaggerations made by the bike lobby and bike fans about what always happens elsewhere. Apparently, Montreal is the greatest city in the entire universe for bikes. Have you been to Montreal lately, Raju?
I have not. I hope to go sometime soon.
De Maisonneuve Boulevard, which is a big east-west thoroughfare right through the entire city, has got a separate bike lane. And when I say separate, there is a concrete divider between the bike lane and the road. And University Avenue leading up to McGill, and on the other side of McGill going up the mountain, has also got a separate bike lane. But you know, St. Catherine Street, Sherbrooke Street, René Lévesque Boulevard, Peel, Mountain, all of these other downtown streets, they don't have bike lanes. And so naturally there's bicycles on them, but there are not even lines on the road. So I actually think that Toronto is much further ahead than Montreal is in that area. I'm a big fan, however, of bike lanes that are clearly separate from where the cars are. In other words, not a line on the road, but where there are dividers that separate the bicycle riders and the motorists. And frankly, bring them on. And as a motorist, I'll tell you why I like that, because I want to know where the cyclists are. If there is just a line on the road, and bless their hearts, but cyclists will ease out into the regular traffic lane, or they'll move out to avoid riding over a grate. And I don't blame them for the great thing. I think some of the other things are sometimes a bit on the irresponsible side. But give me all the bike lanes in the world, but let's divide them and make them as safe for everybody as possible.
Norris, I'm really glad that you got into your nuanced take. And I do think the interesting thing here is that you mentioned the pushback. There has always been a huge fight over bike lanes in this city. Why do you think the city sort of took this chance now?
Well, because as I said, they could get away with it. There's no doubt about the fact that more and more people are riding bicycles. And so the city does have to provide a safer environment for them. I mean, you know, it can be a war out there sometimes if there's no designated bike lane and there's bicyclists riding along. And nobody wants to see anybody get hurt. That's the key thing. Well, you drive a car too. You're a cyclist, but you drive a car. You know, you're riding along and there on the road in front of you is a bicycle rider. And you think, my God, I don't want to hit that person. I'm going to do everything I possibly can. And so you're slowing down. In the meantime, some guy's coming up behind you, doesn't see the cyclist, starts honking. And before you know it, everybody's karma is on a sink, right? So give me separate bike lanes. I don't know if it's ever happened to you, but, you know, when I was in Kingston, I worked in Kingston for a number of years, and I was riding on the Bath Road, as it's called, and I saw a bike rider get hit by a car. And it was one of the most frightening things that I've ever seen in my entire life. Now, it turned out that the bike rider was, for all intents and purposes, a professional bike rider and was an athlete and literally did a couple of somersaults in the air and landed on his feet and kept running. So he escaped injury. The bike was destroyed. But I'll tell you, that can scare the heck out of everybody when they see that sort of thing. So, you know, give me separate designated bike lanes that are separate from the traffic, and I'm all for them.
Amazing story, Norris. That sounds like some Cirque du Soleil type of stuff.
I stopped immediately because I thought the guy was surely going to be dead. And, you know, he did have a bit of a scrape on his hip, but he immediately started apologizing to the person who'd hit him. I mean, everybody stopped. And she, of course, said, no, it's my fault. And the police came and there was no charges because everybody's very apologetic. You can't have that sort of thing happen. And there was no bike lanes on the Bath Road at that time. I haven't been back to Kingston for years, so I don't know whether there are now. Boy, oh boy, that can sure get your attention. By the way, you know, you mentioned something early in our discussion here about when I was the Wheels editor. A lot of people don't realize, but, you know, every year we published a special bicycle edition because, of course, bicycles have wheels. And when I was the editor of Wheels, you know, lawnmowers didn't make it into the pages of Wheels, but, you know, we had motorhomes and we had pickup trucks and we had bicycles. We had one special edition a year. I was always amazed that we didn't get more reaction because it was a complete issue dealing with the trails to ride on in Toronto, bike vacations. In fact, Mark Richardson, who was a former editor of Wheels, he and his wife went on a vacation and he wrote about it in one of these special editions that we had, bike fashion. You know, a lot of people look really good on bicycles. Me and spandex, I shudder to think that's why I
shudder to think about that too, Norris. Now, I think the thing is that it has been fast, and I'm going to speak about one very specific issue, I think, is that I'm right by Dundas. Between Broadview and now Parliament, it's basically gone down to one lane. So now, if you're getting onto Broadview, you know, you're making a right from the far lane. And then the other issue is you get on the DVP there. If it gets busier, you know, with streetcars and cars, it's one lane, you're coming left. Like that to me is going to be a bottleneck and also just potentially busy and dangerous. And don't get me wrong, I'm loving that one lane right now because when riding with my kid, it's now an option. But that's one that I'm like, I'm not so sure about that specifically.
Right. And that's why I say I really do think there has to be a little bit more thought go into some of these initiatives. You know, you get the feeling that some of the cycling fans on council see an opening. Sorry, got to phrase it that way. And bingo, 2 weeks later, or maybe even 2 days later, a major change has been made to a roadway. And that sort of thing as you say, can turn out to be more dangerous than if somebody had thought about it and said, maybe this is what we ought to do. Or, have an experiment, a lot of dialogue, put up one of those flashing signs that you see for construction sites that says 2 weeks from Monday, this will be one lane, so that you're telling people what to expect. I think in many cases, particularly with the bike lanes, they just slap them up, and before you know it, you're browning everybody off. Everybody can coexist. I don't know anybody who is an enemy of cyclists. I think some people consider them irritants. I'm on radio stations frequently with car guys, and of course, they make the arguments, well, if they're going to be on the road, they should stick to the rules of the road and they should have insurance and this, that, and the other thing. I'm not somebody who goes that far, but I really do think that a better dialogue could result in everybody being happy rather than kind of one subgroup feeling that they've won another victory in their quest to turn the entire place into a cycling paradise.
Now, this is the thing, Norris. Do you think this is a Trojan horse or a Trojan bike? Now they're here. Are these here to stay?
Oh, yeah, for sure. For sure. And they'll expand. I think that, however, we talk about the suburbs. I made a point when I wrote that column that somebody who lives in Vaughan, it's highly unlikely that they are going to be commuting to downtown Toronto by bicycle. Highly unlikely. Now, sure as shooting, somebody does, and they'll write a letter to the editor and say, I do it, and if I can do it, everybody can do it. But that's just not realistic. And so I think that they have to be careful about bike lanes in the suburbs. That doesn't mean that there shouldn't be some bike lanes in some areas. Again, that takes study. I'm not talking about procrastinating to the point where we push these decisions back 4 or 5 years. But you know something? You can do a good study of anything having to do with transportation in probably 3 months. At that point, people are going to know whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. And you get feedback from the community, and you then take it from there. I know that the bicycle, I call them the lobby periodically, but the bicycle community will point out time and again that studies have shown that the vast majority of people in Toronto are in favor of bike lanes. And that very well might be true. I'd like to see the studies sometimes. I'd like to see the polls. I'd like to see what the questions were. It's easy to say, do you think it's a good idea to have a bike lane? Yeah, why not? Without really thinking it through. All you really have to do is be realistic about all this. And again, I keep coming back to what we started talking about earlier. There should be designated, separate bike lanes. That will make everybody happy.
Norris, I completely agree. This has made me so happy. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. I want to thank you so much for your time and for being the greatest sport.
Oh, listen, first of all, it's my pleasure. And thank you for having me on. And anytime you want to talk about transportation or the automobile, commuting vis-a-vis public transit, the GO trains, feel free to call.
I will, sir. Norris McDonald is a columnist for the Wheel section of the Toronto Star. Now that we let Norris have his say, we are joined by Matt Elliott. He's a City Affairs columnist for the Toronto Star. His work appears on CBC Toronto, and he is the author of City Hall Watcher, an independent City Hall newsletter at cityhallwatcher.com. He has also written about the new bike lanes and how they are faring. Matt, thank you so much for joining us.
No problem. Happy to be here.
Okay, Matt, let's start off with the headline of your piece, which was thousands of cyclists are hitting Toronto streets during this pandemic. No one should be surprised. You, at the count on, I think, May 23rd, had 34,000 people using the closed off streets with another 11,000 pedestrians. So that's 45,000 people who used at least these specifically closed off streets. I am one of them, and I am surprised. How are these things faring so far?
They're faring amazingly well. It's hard when you're talking about bike lane data because the city does counts when they decide to go out and do a count. So we don't have like an everyday approximation of how many people are using streets, how many people are riding these streets. But, when they do counts, what we see is consistently increases in the number of cyclists that are out there. And those increases are concentrated in places, as you'd expect, where they've installed bike infrastructure, or in the cases of what they've done during the pandemic, where they've closed off streets completely and allowed people to come out and just, ride their bikes and not have to worry about any car traffic getting in their way or hitting them or, whatever sorts of safety issues pop up for cyclists on a lot of roads. So that's why I'm not surprised. It's a very consistent trend we've seen in Toronto. If you give cyclists safe spaces on streets, they are going to show up in numbers to use that infrastructure and to use those streets.
I think the line that you use is from Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. Cyclists will come and claim the space. Okay, if that's the situation, I think the thing that just gets me is that why has it been that previously bike lanes have been so polarized? It's always been a fight. It's always been about, let's go on the less traffic streets, Sherbourne as to Jarvis. Why has that previously been the case?
And it's still the case today. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the piece, is to try to push back against that. It seems like every time bike lanes are proposed in Toronto, it's like a totally new concept. People are like, wow, you want to do what to our streets? You want to put bike lanes on it? I don't know about that. We better have a series of meetings about it and really dig into like every possible thing that could maybe happen if we take a parking lane and put in a separated bike lane. And the point I'm making is like, this is a tried and tested concept in Toronto now. We have bike lanes on major streets downtown, like Adelaide Street, Richmond Street, Bloor Street. And in all cases, when those bike lanes have been installed, there's been a massive increase in the number of cyclists using that infrastructure. And, the doom and gloom that comes up where people talk about, oh no, it's going to destroy businesses or traffic is going to be way worse than it already is because of these bike lanes, those negative outcomes haven't materialized at all. So I really want the city to get to a point where it's like, you know what, we have the evidence now. We do not need to look at this like a totally new concept. We can be confident that by doing this to our streets, we're going to have positive outcomes.
We had our good friend Norris on. He made a point in his column that the city has put in 40 kilometers of bike lanes, basically under the cover of the pandemic. Is that fair to say?
It is fair to say. I mean, that makes it sound like it's a sneaky thing they did. Like they sort of crawled out in the dark of night and started installing bike lanes on our streets, which is a fun image to imagine, but that wasn't the case. There was a council vote on this. There was a report on this. What we are seeing is the city moving way, way quicker to install bike lanes than they ever have in the past. Normally, there is a robust consultation process with several meetings involving the community coming out to like a high school gym and looking at boards and looking at hypothetical projected stats and all this stuff, whereas during the pandemic, you can't really have those kinds of public gatherings. You can do some online consultation, but it's not the same. But also, there's a motivating factor here. Like, we are living at a time when people need space. They need space to move. They need space when they're commuting. They need space when they're out and exercising on the weekends. So that's a new part of the motivation to install bike lanes, is to really look at, okay, when people, start going back to work, they are, I think, understandably going to be reluctant to get on the TTC for a lot of people. And if you can instead offer people a safe, separated bike lane that can get them from point A to point B, then that's a huge win for public health. That, this is not something that people had to really think about before, but it has created a sense of urgency that has led to the city speeding this up. So we're seeing all of these new lanes on University and Dundas East and the Danforth coming this summer. The city has never worked this fast to install bike lanes. So Norris is right about that. But I don't think it is something they've tried to hide. There's a clear rationale for why they're doing this.
All right, I'm going to take a little bit of issue with that because I live beside Dundas East, and it did spring up overnight. And I literally was like, what? And this is actually, I do think that there is a little bit of issue where I think that they do need to fix this. From Dundas and Broadview, now you have to basically make the right from the far lane. And I was driving, and I was like, what? That's here there now? I love it when I ride with my kid. Now Dundas is an option that we haven't taken before. But getting onto the DVP now, when there are a couple of streetcars, and as soon as more cars are around, and it is a single lane there, I think that is going to be a bottleneck as well as potentially some safety issue. So I think that is one specific thing that I'm thinking maybe they could make a change to, or they need to watch that. But I'm with you, man. I ride my bike. What I hate about this discussion is that why are you always have to be either a driver or a cyclist. I do both of these things. I'm a pedestrian. I also ride an electric skateboard because I'm an aging hipster. So multimodal transport is what I'm doing. But the thing is why have all these discussions always been so fraught along those divisive lines?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's like we know based on the population and the census and all kinds of other data that the average person who cycles in Toronto is like you. They tend to own a car, a great percentage of them. So this notion that, you have to make a choice when you become an adult where you're like, I'm going to be a cyclist or I'm going to be a driver and the twain shall meet is ridiculous. People used all kinds of forms of transportation to get around this city, and nobody is exclusive to one mode or another. So yeah, it's a totally false dichotomy and divisive to say, okay, now you are a motorist or now you are a cyclist and you have to belong to this group. Most people belong to both who are in those groups. So yeah, I think it's not helpful at all when people set it up that way, and it's not really true. And I do think there's, I get people, when I wrote the column, I get people sending emails saying, well, what about when you have to go to IKEA and pick up a futon, how are you going to do that on your bike? And it's like, you're not going to do that on your bike. You're going to do that in a car that you own or you rent or whatever. And that's fine. I'm not saying get rid of all cars. Everyone has to sell their cars. It's maybe there are some trips that you take right now in your car where it's like, you know what? Now you can bike because it's a bit safer.
The other flip side of this issue is this, as usual, this is incredibly downtown focused. Where's the bike lane love in the burbs?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think some of it is they're looking for where there is not going to be massive political opposition to bike lanes. Downtown has seen these successes on Adelaide and Richmond and Bloor Street, and there's more of an appetite and a demand for bike lanes. The city knows that they can install these without gigantic backlash. There's always going to be some kind of backlash. Suburbs, there are a few installations coming in suburban Toronto as part of this. But I really think it's trying to build first a critical mass of people looking for bike lanes in the suburbs. They really want to avoid a situation where they install something, people don't feel like they were properly informed. They don't feel like they were given a chance to put in their 2 cents. And then, all of a sudden you sort of poisoned the well on bike lanes in the suburbs for years and years. So I do get being cautious on that, but I think there's a huge opportunity in lots of places. I've heard from people who have been looking at all us downtowners out on the weekends on these closed sections of streets, having an amazing time and saying, wow, I'd love to have something like that I could get to in my neighborhood without having to, a lot of them would be getting in their car and then driving down somewhere near where the closures are. So I think there's a big opportunity for more of that.
Is this a big bike lane Trojan horse or Trojan bike? Are these things going to stick around? Are they going to stick around?
I mean, the city is officially pitching them as temporary infrastructure for the pandemic. So, and there's going to be a lot of tweaking, I think, along the way. So now you mentioned potential bottlenecks on Dundas East. I do think the idea is let's get these things installed, see how they actually work. So we're working in the realm of actual data and real experiences and not just hypotheticals. So there'll be some tweaks along the way. It's possible that, one of the lanes going in maybe just doesn't popular or isn't working and doesn't stick around. But I think based on the routes they've chosen, there's a really good chance, to the point I'd put the money on it. If anybody wants to bet me, let me know, that we're going to see real success on these lanes. Danforth is a good example. I'm very confident that when Danforth Avenue has bike lanes across it, there's going to be just a huge amount of cycling traffic out there. People are going to be loving it. And the idea of, ripping that out after whenever we get out of this pandemic situation just doesn't seem very likely to me. So I put some money on routes like Danforth sticking around.
Matt, that's been fantastic for us. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you think our listeners should know?
I mean, it depends on, what else came up in, what Norris had to say about things.
First off, he got a lot of feedback on his column as well. And his one thing is that, the goal is separated bike lanes. As a motorist, he wants to know where cyclists are and also that they get their space and we get our space. And, that way cyclists perhaps have less likelihood to be, say, irresponsible on the roads, right? That was one of his main points.
Yeah, which is, it's good news because they're really only looking at separated bike lanes now. The notion of installing the old sort of just painted curb lane thing is dead and buried as a concept in the city. They're all in on separated. So he should be happy about that aspect of it. I think more separation in the design would be something that would be nice to see in more places. Like some of these separated bike lanes that are just a few plastic sticks. Drivers can just drive right over them and often do. So more like concrete wood barriers between the lanes for bikes and lanes for cars would be something I'd like to see this design goes forward as well.
Well, I can tell you right now, as long as they close the things on the weekend, I live right by River in Bayview, and basically I've been using River as my personal skateboard ramp on the weekends. So that's what I'm going to be probably doing the weekend. Matt, I want to thank you so much for your time today.
Not a problem at all. Good to talk to you.
Matt Elliott is a City Affairs columnist at the Toronto Star. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Raji Mudder, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etisaz. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Foso. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.